I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the implications of debt and human rights and state responsibility. So debt agreements are negotiated in a private space. Whether it is private debt or it is public debt, it will be debt that is between the state and the party providing the particular resource. Now, the conditionalities that are found in public debt, for example, with the IMF, can be found even on the IMF website, where you can see some of the conditionalities they have. But every single time debt agreements are negotiated, there are also additional clauses that pop up periodically, depending on the economy, depending on the status of the world at any point in time. And so one of the challenges that is facing a lot of developing countries around the world is when debt agreements require you to shift finances from one position to another within a domestic budget. So normally, a government will wake up in the morning, ideally, and pick the weakest in its society, which for me is also the human rights approach or raising living standards approach that I sometimes discuss. Look for the most vulnerable, look for the poorest, look for the areas with the least development, and then focus on those and push up the bottom. And some people call this a grassroots approach, right? So you push up this bottom and that's what you do. Now, the problem that starts to arise is when somebody who gives you funding to develop or to build a particular part of the economy now asks you to redirect how the money is spent. But when it's time to pay back the debt, asks you to also redirect where the money is spent so that the priority now becomes debt repayment. Now, if I was a private person and I took on a debt and I had to pay an interest rate on it, it's very straightforward, right? I'm going to take a debt, I'm going to earn a profit, and then with the profit from my business, for example, then I am paying off my debt and my interest rate. But the challenge with public debt that states take on is that these investments are not for profitability. So you don't 5 years later see this growth of an economy suddenly that's going to allow you to pay back this profit. So it's even the conceptualization of a debt agreement then starts to give challenges to developing countries. But now let's take it to the next step. There are projections on how to assess not only the state at which an economy is, but how the economy is going to develop in future. And that is how they then assess the repayment schedules and the interest rates sometimes as well. But after COVID, you cannot measure that anymore. You can no longer have a clear trajectory on how an economy is going to grow because there were so many setbacks during COVID. So the data that countries use, the statistics that they're using, we haven't even had enough time to reconfigure them properly to understand how profitable certain debts are going to be. So now it comes this challenge of what people call austerity. I've heard language like structural adjustment recently as well, that we're back in that cycle again. And the challenge that I start to see is that for 40, 50 years, many governments, especially in the developing world, have actually been funding education and healthcare systems up to and including parts of universities. And now there is this redirection of money towards the repayment of the loan, but without any consideration being given for the fact that COVID took place. And in fact, if you have natural resources, you're more likely to get a loan as well right now, even though the world is scrambling on the issue of climate change and climate financing. So there's almost, I would say, even an element of a little bit of schizophrenia in how we're dealing with the space broadly. And so you have these problems happening, and then a government gets stuck because maybe the government wants to spend money on certain things, but they actually have to pay off the loan. And because we have a political cycle, which is usually between 5 and 7 years, often the government that received the loan isn't the government that's paying off the loan, but you have to respect that. And so the ones repaying it never had a part in collecting it sometimes, and then never had a part in how it was spent. So it depends from country to country. But if I then move you to the conversation around illicit financial flows, and here is where it is probably the most interesting solution in the world as we speak, because money is constantly being shifted around and moved to different spaces. And it is being moved around to different spaces in order to hide it and in order that they don't pay taxes. And unfortunately, this causes a lot of problems. So there are reasons one would move your money to another country. You want to diversify your personal accounts, for example. Your country is maybe not politically stable, there's violence, you want to put your currency in another space. These are valid arguments to shift your money outside one's home country. But more and more, it is the place where criminal activity takes place. So where do people park money that they make from criminal actions they've taken? They are often in these spaces that are called tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions. And then they become part of the problem of illicit financial flows. And Africa has taken a wonderful step forward. In 2015, we defined what we meant by illicit financial flows. And yet the world remains resistant to recognizing what 54 plus countries have agreed in the world. I think that is the majority block on the definition as we stand. And so it's very important to recognize what is a very clear African approach to illicit financial flows. And then it is time for African governments to now come back and make sure that these illicit financial flows are truly tracked and stopped. It is absolutely crucial. And so illicit financial flows, if not checked, have two effects. First, it's the money moving out of the country. But the second is, if that money was circulating within the country, it would actually be generating business and economy, and then it would also be generating taxes. So it's a double loss. It's the economic circulation of finance, and then it's the ability of a government to collect resources from it. And so illicit financial flows continue to undermine the ability of a country to continue to develop. And if they cannot collect taxes, then they're going to go into debt. And then if they don't have taxes, they cannot spend it on their people. And then you come into that situation where you find countries that are seriously cash-strapped, that are put into situations where now their populations are demanding accountability. But it's part of the global system that we're in that's causing a lot of challenges.